Terrence Hale arrived 12 minutes early because that was what you did when everything was riding on one interview. The waiting room at Pierce Grid Systems smelled like fresh paint and quiet money. He straightened his tie, then noticed a young woman near the far wall chasing papers that had scattered across the floor. She looked mid-20s at most. No assistant with her, no lanyard, just a simple blazer and an armful of documents trying to escape. Terrence crossed the room and helped her gather them. "First interview?" he asked. "Something like that," she said. He meant well. He told her not to let her age work against her. That real ability always surfaced in the end. He even shared a little of what he'd researched about the company's distribution gaps, hoping to give her an edge. She listened. She smiled. She said nothing to correct him. Then the door opened and an assistant said in a calm and deliberate voice, "The board is ready for you, Ms. Pierce." CEO Pierce. The woman stood, smoothed her blazer, and walked to the door. She paused and glanced back at him. "I'll see you inside, Mr. Hale." If you've ever been written off before anyone gave you a real chance, this story is for you. Subscribe and follow the channel so you don't miss where it goes. Terrence Hale was the kind of analyst who made other analysts uncomfortable. Not because he was difficult, he wasn't. He showed up on time, answered emails the same day, and never took credit that wasn't his. What made people uncomfortable was simpler and harder to argue with. He was usually right, and not in the way that required an audience. He would glance at a spreadsheet and quietly ask why a particular routing cluster underperformed on Tuesday afternoons specifically, and 3 days later, someone would confirm it was the shift changeover at the Brockton facility. He didn't celebrate. He just moved on to the next problem. That ability had kept him employed for 11 years at a regional freight company outside Boston until the company merged with a larger operation out of Atlanta, and the new ownership decided that regional expertise was a redundancy they couldn't justify. Terrence was given a severance package, a letter of recommendation that used the word thorough 4 times, and a Tuesday afternoon free for the first time in a decade. That was nearly 6 months ago. The savings account was dropping below a number he didn't like to look at directly. The rent on the 2-bedroom apartment in Dorchester was due in 9 days. His car, a 2017 Civic with a transmission that had been threatening to give up since February, had cost him $400 last month and would likely cost more next month. None of that was the part that kept him awake. What kept him awake was Sadie. His daughter was 8 years old and thought her father was the smartest person alive. She brought him math problems from school, not because she couldn't solve them, but because she liked to see how fast he could. She made him coffee on weekend mornings badly with too much sugar and set it on his desk with a seriousness that made his chest ache. Her mother had left when Sadie was 2, and Terrence had made a decision in that kitchen in Dorchester that he would not let the absence define either of them. He had kept that promise, but promises required a floor to stand on, and the floor was getting thinner. Pierce Grid Systems had reached out through a recruiter 3 weeks earlier. The position was Director of Operations Analytics, a role built for someone who could translate messy, real-world logistics data into decisions that actually held up when the trucks hit the road. The salary was enough to change things, not to make them easy, but to make them stable, which in Terrence's current vocabulary was a more important word. He had researched the company the way he researched everything methodically, without rushing to conclusions. Pierce Grid Systems was a logistics technology firm, 6 years old, headquartered in Boston's Seaport District, growing faster than most of its competitors, and doing it with a leaner team. The founder and CEO was a woman named Leona Pierce. There wasn't much about her in the press, a few trade publication interviews, one profile in a tech journal that spent more time describing how young she looked than what her company actually did. What Terrence found interesting, and what the profile hadn't bothered to highlight, was that the company's warehouse network had a structural inconsistency in the northeastern corridor that nobody seemed to have addressed. He filed that away. The waiting room held 4 chairs and a small table with a water pitcher nobody had touched. Terrence took the chair nearest the window, set his portfolio on his lap, and began going over his notes for the 3rd time that morning. That was when the papers fell. He heard them before he saw them, a soft cascade from across the room, followed by a quiet, controlled exhale that suggested the person making it was used to handling problems without making a scene. A young woman in a navy blazer and dark slacks was crouching near the far wall, gathering documents that had fanned out across the floor. No assistant, no tote bag with a company logo, just a stack of folders that had gotten away from her. She looked mid-20s at most, maybe younger. Terrence set down his notes, crossed the room, collected the nearest pages without asking permission, and held them out. She looked up. She had careful eyes, the kind that took inventory of a room before committing to anything, and she accepted the papers with a nod that was more composed than grateful. "Thanks," she said. "No problem." He gestured at the chair beside her. "You here for the analytics position? I'm here for the interview," she said, which if he'd been paying closer attention wasn't quite the same thing. He wasn't paying closer attention. He was thinking about how young she seemed and how that was the kind of thing that could throw you off in a room full of people who expected to see someone older, and he'd been in enough of those rooms to know how quickly that expectation could become a verdict. "First time interviewing somewhere like this?" he asked. She tilted her head slightly. "What makes you ask?" "Nothing specific. You just seem like you're still deciding how you want to come across. Don't try to seem older than you are. They can tell and it doesn't help. What helps is knowing something they don't expect you to know." "Like what?" he told her. Not everything. He wasn't going to walk a competitor through his entire research, but enough. He mentioned that the company's on-time delivery rates in the northeastern corridor had slipped over the previous quarter in a way the forecasting software hadn't flagged, which suggested the problem wasn't in the algorithm, but somewhere upstream, scheduling maybe, or handoffs. She was quiet for a moment. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Terrence shrugged. "Because if we're both good enough, they should find a way to keep both of us. I'm not interested in getting ahead by making sure you don't." He meant it. He had meant it every time he'd said something like it over his career, and he was aware it was not the most common philosophy in a waiting room full of people competing for the same position. But he had Sadie to think about, which meant he couldn't afford to be someone she'd be embarrassed by later. The young woman looked at him for a long moment, and something shifted in her expression, subtle like a door opening just slightly further than it had been. "That's a generous thing to say," she said. "It's a practical thing," he said. "Generous would be if I gave you my notes." The door opened. The assistant who stepped through was a man in his 30s with a lanyard and the practiced walk of someone who had delivered news in waiting rooms for a long time. "The board is ready for you, Ms. Pierce," he said, addressing the young woman without looking at Terrence at all. CEO Pierce. The room didn't change physically, but Terrence felt it change anyway, a rearrangement of pressure, the way a car feels different the moment you realize the exit you needed is already behind you. The woman stood. She smoothed her blazer. She picked up her folders with the same unhurried calm she'd had on the floor when the papers scattered, and she looked at Terrence with an expression that was, if he was reading it right, almost kind. "I'll see you inside, Mr. Hale." She walked through the door. The assistant held it and waited. Terrence stood. The conference room was long and pale and lit from above with the particular brightness of rooms where decisions are made and defended. Leona Pierce sat at the center of the table. To her left and right were four people Terrence recognized from the company's public page. Two senior directors, the head of product and Graham Rourke, a board member with the kind of silver hair and crossed arms that communicated a specific flavor of skepticism before anyone had said a word. Terrence took his seat across from them, aware with precise and unpleasant clarity that at least two people in the room had already been told what happened in the waiting room. He could see it in the way Graham Rourke had arranged his face, not quite smiling, but close to something that would become a smile if Terrence gave it a reason to. Leona spoke first. "Before we begin," she said, "I want to give you the opportunity to revisit anything you said in the waiting room. If there's something you'd like to walk back now, would be the appropriate time." The professional answer was simple. Acknowledge the misunderstanding, deflect it with a practiced line about the informal setting, move on. Half the table would accept it. The other half had already made up their minds regardless. The path of least damage was clear, and Terrence did not take it. "I thought you were a candidate," he said. "I made that assumption based on your age and the way you were dressed, and I acted on it without questioning it. That was a mistake, and it's a specific kind of mistake because 20 minutes earlier, I told you not to let people make that mistake about you. I'm aware of how that lands." Leona held his gaze. "And the advice you gave, I stand behind the advice," he said. "I don't stand behind the assumption that generated it." Silence moved around the table at different speeds. Graham Rourke uncrossed his arms. One of the directors made a note. Leona nodded once briefly and moved on. "We have a performance problem," she said, and turned a laptop toward him. "On-time delivery rates across 3 distribution hubs have declined by 11% over the past 2 quarters. Our forecasting system shows no anomalies. Walk me through how you'd approach it." Terrence looked at the data and saw it in under a minute. The performance data was segmented by region, but not cross-referenced with shift transition windows. The algorithm was evaluating each hub in isolation, which meant it was missing the gaps, the intervals, when freight sat in a handoff zone between one cruise close and the next cruise open, unmonitored and untracked. He said so not as a speech, just as a sequence of observations following each other logically until they arrived at a conclusion. The issue wasn't the forecasting model. The issue was that the model was only measuring what the system officially recorded, and somewhere in those 3 hubs, workers were marking transfers complete before the receiving crew had actually taken ownership. It made their individual numbers look cleaner. It made the aggregate data useless. "The problem isn't the algorithm," he said. "The algorithm is measuring the wrong moment." No one spoke for a few seconds. Leona closed the laptop. "We've had 2 consultants review that data in the last 8 months. "I know," Terrence said. "I read both reports. They looked at routing efficiency and fleet utilization. Neither one asked what was happening between shifts." She looked at him with something that wasn't quite surprise, more like recognition. 3-month probationary contract, she said. Director of Operations Analytics reporting to Bridget Sloan. Graham Rourke's chair shifted. His mouth opened. Leona continued without turning toward him. "The offer will be in your email by end of day, Mr. Hale." Terrence accepted. He walked back through the waiting room, empty now, and took the elevator down to the lobby. Outside, the October air came off the harbor with enough edge to clear his head. He had the job. He also had an entire building full of people who already knew the story of how he'd tried to coach the CEO before his interview. And somewhere on the 14th floor, a board member with crossed arms who had heard it and was deciding what to do with it. He thought about Sadie, who would be getting off the school bus in 4 hours. He thought about the rent. He put his collar up against the wind and walked back to his car. The rumor reached him on his 3rd day. He heard it the way you hear most things in a new office, not directly, but through the particular silence that settles over a conversation. When you walk into a room, a group near the coffee station, 2 words catching air before the rest got swallowed. The CEO. Then nothing, and the performance of people who suddenly found their phones very interesting. Celeste Warren was the one who told him plainly. She ran the client relations department and had in Terrence's assessment the specific competence of someone who had spent years being underestimated by people who later needed her to fix what they'd broken. She knocked on his office doorframe on a Thursday morning and said without preamble, "You should know what people are saying." He knew. He let her say it anyway. The story circulating was simple and efficient. Leona Pierce had been charmed by the man in the waiting room, and the rest was favoritism dressed up in interview paperwork. It didn't matter that his analysis of the shift handoff issue had been the first original diagnosis of that problem in 8 months of consultant reports. Stories about competence were harder to circulate than stories about shortcuts. "Does it change anything you're planning to do?" Celeste asked. "No," he said. "Good, Jay," she said, and went back to her department. Bridget Sloan, the chief operating officer, was not hostile. She was precise, which was a different thing. She didn't make small talk, and she didn't issue reassurances, and when she handed Terrence his first assignment, she looked at him the way someone looks at a measurement they intend to verify. 3 distribution hubs, on-time delivery, declining root cause analysis, and proposed solution within 2 weeks. It was not technically an impossible task, but Bridget knew, and Terrence understood. She knew that it would require the kind of sustained access to floor-level data that new managers rarely secured in 2 weeks, particularly when the hub supervisors had no strong reason to cooperate with someone they'd heard about through a rumor. Terrence did not push for cooperation. He requested raw data logs, time-stamped shift records, and transfer confirmation timestamps going back 6 months. He pulled them himself from the operations database, sorted them at his desk, before Sadie's school day ended, and had dinner ready by 6 every night regardless. He could not work past 9, and he did not apologize for that. What he found in the logs confirmed what he'd suspected in the interview. At all 3 hubs, freight was being marked transferred before the receiving crew had physically signed off. The gap, sometimes 12 minutes, sometimes 40, didn't appear in the routing data because the system treated the first timestamp as final. Nothing was being stolen. Nobody was acting with malice. Workers were hitting a target they'd been given, and the target happened to create a blind spot the size of 11%. He documented everything and sent it to Bridget. Her response came at 7:15 the following morning. Come to my office at 8. He went. She had printed his report and annotated it in 3 colors. If we change the confirmation protocol, she said, we disrupt transfer flow at every hub simultaneously. We have 22 hubs in the Northeast network. You've identified 3. What happens to the other 19 while we're correcting the first 3? Nothing if we phase the rollout by volume tier, Terrence said. Start with the 3 highest volume hubs. Lock in the correction window on Tuesday and Wednesday when load is lowest. Monitor for 2 weeks before moving to the next tier. Bridget looked at him over the top of her reading glasses. You've already mapped the implementation. I mapped it before I wrote the report, he said. It seemed like the next logical step. She was quiet for a moment. Then she uncapped a pen and wrote something at the top of the first page. I'll need a full timeline by Friday, she said. It was the closest thing to approval he was going to get, and he understood that. The client was Hartwell Retail Group, 1,600 distribution points across the eastern seaboard, a logistics budget that made Terrence's previous employer look like a side project, and a procurement team that had already walked away from 2 competing bids. Pierce Grid Systems needed to win this contract to fund the next phase of network expansion. Everyone in the building understood that, and the understanding sat in the air like pressure before rain. Leona was leading the presentation herself. She had spent 3 weeks refining the pitch deck, and the centerpiece was a live demonstration of the company's forecasting model, real data and live outputs, showing Hartwell exactly how precisely Pierce Grid could predict delivery timelines across their network. The dress rehearsal was scheduled for Monday morning. Terrence sat in the 3rd row of the conference room and watched the model run, and he saw the problem in the second output screen. The forecasting model was producing clean numbers, impressive numbers, the kind that would make a procurement team lean forward in their chairs. But Terrence had spent the past 2 weeks inside the raw transfer data, and he recognized what he was looking at. The model had been calibrated to exclude a specific subset of transfer delay records flagged internally as statistical outliers. Those records weren't outliers. They were the Tuesday and Wednesday low-load windows at the high-volume hubs, the exact period where the handoff gap was most likely to occur. The model wasn't wrong on paper. It met every technical specification it had been designed to meet. But it was making a promise the current system in its current state could not reliably keep. He wrote the concern down and sent it through the correct internal channel to the Director of Product Analytics, who forwarded it upward. By end of day, the response came back through 2 intermediaries. The presentation and timeline were fixed. The model had been reviewed by 2 senior engineers, and Terrence should focus on his own deliverables. He had Sadie's school pickup at 4. He made it with 6 minutes to spare, and he listened to her tell him about a disagreement with her best friend over the rules of a card game, and he gave the disagreement his full attention because she deserved that. He made dinner. He helped with homework. He read 2 chapters of her book to her when she asked, even though she was perfectly capable of reading it herself because she asked. Then he sat at his desk and wrote a single-page summary of the forecasting discrepancy and what it would mean for Hartwell Retail Group when the first quarterly review revealed a gap between what had been promised and what the system could produce. The next morning was the final pre-presentation review attended by the full senior leadership team and Graham Rourke, who had flown in from New York specifically to observe. Leona opened the meeting. Is the team ready to present? The room indicated through the particular language of nodding and folder straightening that the answer was yes. No, Terrence said. The room found its stillness quickly. He didn't stand up. He didn't raise his voice. He said that the model as currently configured was excluding a class of delay events that would reappear in live network conditions, specifically during high-volume period transitions, and that if Hartwell signed a contract based on the forecast outputs in the current deck, Pierce Grid Systems would be delivering a performance guarantee it could not honor within the first 6 months. Silence moved around the table differently than it had in the interview room. This one had an edge to it, Graham Rourke was the first to speak. "You're a 3-week probationary hire questioning a model that was built and reviewed by this company's senior engineering team." "I'm a 3-week probationary hire who spent 2 weeks in the raw transfer data," Terrence said. "The outlier exclusion is in the calibration notes. I can show anyone in this room exactly which records were removed and why they shouldn't have been." Graham looked at Leona. "This is what I was concerned about." Leona looked at Terrence, her expression giving away nothing useful. "You have 48 hours, she said. "Build the corrected model. Show me what the actual numbers look like. If you're right, we delay the presentation. If you're wrong, we proceed as scheduled, and you and I will have a separate conversation." Graham opened his mouth. "Thank you, Graham," Leona said in a tone that closed the topic. Terrence worked through 2 evenings. He picked Sadie up on time both days. He did not tell her what was at stake, but she was 8 years old and observant, and on the second night, she left a glass of water on his desk without being asked. The corrected model showed that under real network conditions, the delivery performance guarantee in the current pitch would be accurate approximately 73% of the time, which meant that in the first year of the Hartwell contract, roughly 1 in 4 quarterly reviews would show a gap. Leona reviewed the numbers at 7 in the morning alone before anyone else arrived. She delayed the presentation by 2 weeks. The pitch was rebuilt around the corrected model, slightly less impressive on paper, substantially more accurate in practice. When the new version went to Hartwell, the procurement team's lead analyst asked a question that had apparently derailed both previous bids. "What happens to your accuracy numbers when you account for high-volume transition periods?" Leona's team had a specific data-supported, honest answer. Pierce Grid Systems won the contract. Bridget found Terrence at his desk afterward and said, "Good work," in the same tone she used for everything, which meant that from her it was genuine. Celeste sent him a message that just said, "Still told you." Leona did not come to his office, but that evening as he was packing up to get Sadie, he passed her in the hallway and she said without stopping, "Thank you for not letting me walk into that room." He understood from the way she said it that she meant more than the Hartwell presentation. The client dinner was at a restaurant in the back bay that served food on plates smaller than the descriptions on the menu. Terrence had been added to the Hartwell account team and was therefore present, which was fine. The part that was not fine was the senior Hartwell executive who spent the first 20 minutes speaking exclusively to Terrence and the 2 male directors, then turned to Leona and asked which of the gentlemen at the table she worked for. Terrence watched her process it. She did it very fast, a compression behind the eyes, a decision made in under a second. She had answered this question before. She had a version of herself that handled it efficiently and moved on, and he didn't let her use it. "She doesn't work for any of us," Terrence said easily, the way you correct a minor factual error. "Leona Pierce founded this company. The platform you're planning to put your entire Eastern Seaboard operation on, she built it." The executive recalibrated. Apologies were made. The dinner continued. Afterward, on the sidewalk, while the clients were retrieving their car, Leona stood beside him and didn't say anything for a moment. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. "I had it handled. I know that too." She looked at him in a particular way that made him understand they had moved without either of them explicitly deciding to into different territory. Then something behind her expression drew back into professional distance deliberately, and he recognized why. "I need to keep this clean," she said quietly. "I understand," he said, and he did. Whatever was forming between them, and he was not going to pretend he didn't know what it was, existed at a specific intersection of problem and consequence. She had hired him. He reported to a structure she controlled. Any step towards something personal would hand every person in that building exactly the story they were already telling. They didn't talk about it again. But Graham Rourke had not been standing on the sidewalk. He was in the car behind them, and the car had not left yet. Graham had come to the dinner because Graham attended anything involving a contract of that size, and he had spent the evening watching the space between Leona and Terrence, the way a man watches something he intends to use later. He began collecting, not aggressively, quietly, in the way experienced board members collect things. Meeting schedules, project assignments, the speed with which Terrence had been added to the Hartwell team, a photograph someone had taken of the two of them at a company event standing close together in a moment that, removed from context, suggested more than a working relationship. 3 weeks later, a brief item appeared on a logistics industry blog, with an audience of roughly 8,000 people and a comment section that could generously be described as opinionated. The item asked whether Pierce Grid's recent Hartwell win was really a team achievement, or whether it reflected the CEO's tendency to reward people she had personal reasons to favor. Terrence's name was not in the item. It didn't need to be. The office shifted. Not dramatically, this was a professional environment, and most people were professional, but conversations shortened when he approached. A project he'd been scheduled to join was reassigned to another manager with no explanation from Bridget, who sent him an email that was 2 sentences and contained no information. Celeste came by his office again, and this time she didn't have anything encouraging to say. She sat down across from him. "Graham Rourke is building something," she said. "I don't know what he's going to do with it, but I know what it's aimed at." Terrence thanked her. He picked Sadie up from school and she showed him a drawing she'd made of a building with a lot of windows that she said was his office. She had put him in one of the windows, very small, with a briefcase. He put it on the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a lobster that they'd gotten on a trip to Maine 2 years ago when things had been easier, and he stood at the refrigerator for a minute after she went to do her homework. The emergency board meeting was called on a Wednesday and was not technically about Terrence. It was about governance, about the protocols Pierce Grid Systems had in place to ensure that the CEO's personal relationships, actual or perceived, did not influence hiring, compensation, or project assignment decisions. Graham Rourke had prepared a 14-page document and circulated it before the meeting. Terrence heard about it through Celeste, who had heard about it through the head of HR, who had read it and immediately contacted the company's legal team. Terrence requested a copy and received it 2 hours before the meeting. It was careful work. Graham had not fabricated anything. He had taken real events, the waiting room, the hire, the rapid assignment to the Hartwell team, the dinner, and arranged them into a sequence that read, without context, as a coherent and damaging story. There was no smoking gun in it. There didn't need to be. The document's argument was structural. The appearance of impropriety was sufficient justification for an independent review of Leona's decision-making authority, pending which her operational powers should be suspended. The subtext, which Graham had not written because he didn't need to, was that the company had been approached by an acquiring firm. The board vote was currently split, and a governance crisis would resolve that split in a specific direction. Leona's legal team told her that anything she said in defense of Terrence would be entered into the record and would make the document's thesis more credible, not less. The optics of a CEO publicly defending an employee she was alleged to have favored were, her lawyer explained, not ideal. She called Terrence into her office at 8 in the morning, the day before the board meeting. She told him what the lawyer had said. She told him what she intended to say anyway. He let her finish. "Don't," he said. She looked at him. "If you go into that meeting and defend me, you hand Graham exactly what he needs. The company takes a hit you spent 6 years building, and in 6 months you look back and trace the line directly to the decision to keep me in a building where it was easy to draw conclusions." "Those conclusions are wrong," she said. "I know they're wrong." "They're also easier to circulate than the truth," he said, keeping his voice level. "And Graham knows that, and he's betting on it. Don't let him collect." She stood up and walked to the window. Boston Harbor was doing what it always did, moving indifferent, lit up by the kind of early November light that made everything look simultaneously clear and cold. "Terrence," she said, and stopped. He understood what was in that pause. He had been a single father for 6 years, which meant he had learned to carry weight without putting it down in rooms where it would distract from what needed doing. "Sadie asks me sometimes why I work so hard," he said. "I tell her because I want her to watch someone keep their word. I told her I would be someone worth watching." He submitted the resignation letter that afternoon, 1-page, professional, concise, with a transfer document attached that handed his project files to the next manager in a format they could actually use. He cleaned his desk in under 15 minutes because he had never accumulated the kind of clutter that required more time. Celeste met him at the elevator. She didn't say anything. She put her hand briefly on his arm and then stepped back. The elevator opened. He got in. 2 floors above him, Leona Pierce stood at the window of her office and did not move for a long time. That evening, the system Terrence had built, the corrected transfer confirmation protocol and the phased rollout across the northeastern hubs, encountered its first failure under the management of a team that didn't fully understand what he'd constructed and had removed what they considered a redundant verification step in order to accelerate the deployment timeline. By morning, 3 hubs were producing cascading errors. Orders were stacking. The Hartwell account team's phones were ringing. Terrence was home making Sadie's lunch for the next day, and he was doing it carefully, the way he did everything. Bridget Sloan was the one who called him at 6:47 in the morning, which told him the situation had been developing for several hours before anyone admitted it was serious enough to make calls. He let it ring once, looked at Sadie still asleep in her room, and stepped into the hallway before answering. Bridget did not waste time on context. 3 hubs down. Hartwell's operations team had already sent 2 emails and made 1 phone call to the account manager. The verification layer Terrence had designed, the one that required a dual confirmation before a transfer timestamp was logged as complete, had been removed 4 days ago by the incoming manager, who had described it in an internal note as a redundant processing step that was slowing deployment. The result was exactly what Terrence had built the layer to prevent. Transfers were being logged before physical handoffs completed. The system was producing confident numbers in real time. The actual freight was stacking in the gap. "I'm not calling to ask you to fix it," Bridget said. "I'm calling to ask if you're willing to." Terrence watched the light change under Sadie's door. She would be awake in 20 minutes, and he needed to have breakfast started by then. "I'll need red access to the current configuration," he said, "and I won't do it as a Pierce Grid employee." "Independent contractor," Bridget said immediately, which told him she had already cleared the language with legal. "No reporting line to Leona, no compensation," he said. Silence. "Terrence, there are workers at those hubs who are going to have a very bad week if Hartwell pulls out," he said. "That's the reason I'm doing it. Make sure that's in writing somewhere." He made breakfast. He walked Sadie to the corner where the bus stopped, listened to her thoughts on whether the card game dispute from 2 months ago had ever been properly resolved, and concluded that it had not, but that Sadie was handling it with more diplomatic nuance than most adults he'd worked with. He kissed the top of her head and watched the bus until it turned the corner. Then he sat down at his laptop and got to work. The problem was not complicated. It was just invisible to anyone who hadn't built the original system. The verification layer had not simply been removed. Its removal had created a dependency error 3 steps downstream that was causing the hub management software to default to a legacy timestamp protocol. He wrote a patch, documented every change in a format a first-year analyst could follow, and sent it to Bridget with instructions. While he was writing the documentation, he found the anomaly. It was in the deployment log, a record of system changes made in the 72 hours before the cascade failure. Most changes were routine. One was not. Someone with administrator credentials had manually overridden a security checkpoint that would normally have flagged the removal of the verification layer for supervisory review. The override had been executed at 11:43 on a Tuesday night. The credential ID attached to it traced back to an account that had been issued to an external technical consultant. Terrence checked the consultant registry. The account had been provisioned through Graham Rourke's board office. He stared at this for a moment. Graham had been careful enough that no one would stumble across the override by accident. What he hadn't accounted for was someone who had built the system from scratch and knew exactly which logs to read and in what order. Terrence sent it to Bridget with a separate note that said only, "This needs to go to legal before it goes anywhere else." On the 14th floor of the Seaport building, Leona Pierce had not slept. She had the board meeting in 4 hours. Graham's governance document had been distributed to all 7 board members, and 4 had responded. 2 responses were neutral. One was supportive of Graham's position, and one was from a board member who had sent a single sentence: "This feels like a setup. Call me." She had called. The board member, a woman named Patricia Aldridge, who had been one of Pierce Grid's first outside investors, told her that Graham had been in communication with an acquiring firm for at least 3 months, and that the governance document was a mechanism, not a principle. "The question," Patricia said, "is what you want to do about it." Leona knew what the lawyer wanted her to do. Take the defensive posture, minimize the association with Terrence. Accept a temporary independent review of her decision-making authority, endure it, emerge with her position intact, and let the acquisition die once the board saw there was no real scandal. It was the correct answer, professionally, the answer that protected the company in the shortest path between the problem and the resolution. It also required her to sit in a room and not contradict a document that used Terrence's work and her own judgment as evidence of a failure she didn't believe she'd committed. She thought about the waiting room. Not the embarrassing part, the other part where a man who had every reason to treat a stranger as a competitor had instead handed her information and told her a company should find a way to keep both of them. She thought about the Hartwell presentation, the way he'd stood up in that room knowing exactly what it was going to cost him and said what needed to be said anyway. She thought about the sidewalk outside the restaurant, the way he'd introduced her without making it about himself, and then immediately stepped back. She picked up the phone and called Patricia Aldridge again. "I'm going to need the meeting recorded, she said, "and I want it live streamed to the shareholder portal." A pause. "Leona, I know what it is, she said. "Please make sure it happens." The board meeting was in the same conference room where Terrence had been interviewed 4 months earlier. Leona noticed this. She did not find it ironic so much as clarifying. Graham had prepared remarks, and he delivered them the way a man delivers something he has practiced until the delivery itself feels like proof of reasonableness. The governance concerns were legitimate. The appearance of impropriety, whatever the underlying facts, created reputational risk. The proposed independent review was not punitive. It was protective of the company, of the shareholders, of Leona herself. He used the word protective 3 times. When he finished, Leona spoke. She did not use notes. She had written them and then set them aside that morning because she had decided that if she was going to say what she was going to say, she should be able to say it in her own words without a document to hide behind. She told the room and the shareholders watching on the portal, and anyone who would watch the recording afterward, that she had developed personal feelings for Terrence Hale. She said it plainly without softening it, because the softened version was how the document had been able to make its argument by filling in what she hadn't said. She then walked through every decision she had made regarding his employment. The hire made in a panel interview with 4 senior staff present and documented in full. The Hartwell project assignment made by Bridget Sloan based on his demonstrated knowledge of the transfer gap issue. The account team inclusion recommended by the Director of Product Analytics in writing 2 days before Leona had even been informed of it. She put the Hartwell contract on the table. She put the corrected forecast model beside it. She put Bridget's original project assignment memo beside that. Every decision that Graham's document characterizes as personal favoritism, she said, was made through a documented process that I either did not initiate or did not participate in alone. I'm happy to have any of that reviewed by any independent body this board chooses. What I am not willing to do is allow a governance document to substitute a sequence of implications for actual evidence. She looked at Graham. This morning I received documentation indicating that the cascade failure affecting 3 of our distribution hubs was preceded by a manual override of a security checkpoint. That override was executed using credentials provisioned through this board member's office. She set the printout on the table and slid it toward the center. I have referred that documentation to legal counsel, and I am formally requesting that the board commission an independent investigation, not of my judgment of this. Graham's expression did not collapse. Men like Graham did not have expressions that collapsed, but something behind it recalculated. Patricia Aldridge spoke, then one of the neutral board members, then the third. By the time the meeting adjourned, Graham Rourke had been removed from the board pending investigation, the acquisition discussion had been formally tabled, and Leona's operational authority had been confirmed without suspension. She sat in the empty conference room afterward for 8 minutes. She was not celebrating. She was accounting for the cost of what had just happened, the people who would be affected by the investigation. The months of work ahead before any of this became something the company could simply move past. Then she stood up and went back to work. The patch Terrence had written stabilized the 3 hubs within 6 hours. The phased correction rollout, the same one he had originally mapped for Bridget in the format she'd requested by Friday, was reinstated across the northeastern network over the following 2 weeks. Hartwell's operations team received a direct briefing from Bridget and the account manager. The contract held. The hub workers had a bad week. Then they had a normal week. Then they had a better one. Celeste sent Terrence a message the evening the hubs came back online. It said, "Still told you." He understood she had been telling him from the beginning and had not stopped. The independent review of Terrence's hiring and project assignment was completed by an outside firm retained by the board. It took 3 weeks and was thorough in the way reviews are when nobody controls the outcome. Its conclusions occupied 4 paragraphs of a 12-page report, and those 4 paragraphs found no evidence of preferential treatment in any documented decision. For the first time since the waiting room, Terrence's work had been evaluated by people who had no stake in the result either way. The report was added to the company's governance record and filed. It felt to him less like vindication than like the conversation finally being had in the right room. Bridget called him a week after the report was released. "The board has established an independent promotion and assignment committee," she said. "Effective immediately. All senior-level personnel decisions require sign-off from that committee. Leona is not a member." "I know her," he said. "I read the announcement." "The committee reviewed your file last Thursday," Bridget said. "The Director of Operations Strategy position has been open for 2 months. We'd like you to take it." He was quiet for a moment. "The offer will be in your email by end of day," she said, and he heard in her voice the precise echo of something that had been said to him 4 months ago in this same company's conference room. "I'll review it tonight," he said. He did. He accepted the following morning. Leona met Sadie on a Saturday in early December outside a bookstore in Cambridge that Terrence had been taking his daughter to since she was 4. He had told Leona the address and the time and left the rest to her. She arrived 3 minutes early and stood on the sidewalk in a coat that was not a blazer and did not signal anything about who she was at work, and Terrence thought she looked more nervous than he had ever seen her in a board meeting. Sadie came out of the store carrying 2 books, saw Leona, and stopped. "Are you the candidate?" Sadie asked. Leona looked at Terrence. "She means the one from the waiting room," he said. Leona looked back at Sadie. "I am." Sadie evaluated this with the seriousness she applied to most things. "Dad said he gave you advice." "He did." "Was it good advice?" Leona considered it carefully. "He told me that a leader doesn't need to always be right. They need to be willing to listen when someone tells them they might be wrong. It turned out to be the most useful thing anyone said to me that year." Sadie appeared to accept this. She looked at the 2 books in her arms, then held one out to Leona. "You can borrow this one if you want. It's about a girl who starts a company." "I would like that," Leona said. They walked to the coffee shop on the next block. Sadie ordered hot chocolate and negotiated unsuccessfully for a second one. She told Leona about the card game dispute, which had by now developed enough history to require some background, and Leona listened with the same attention she gave quarterly reviews, which Sadie seemed to recognize and appreciate. At some point, Terrence watched his daughter explain the rules of the card game using a sugar packet and 3 napkins as visual aids, and he watched Leona follow along without pretending it was simpler than it was, and he thought about the waiting room, the papers on the floor. The advice he'd given someone he'd misread entirely, the door opening. He had been wrong about who she was. She had been waiting to see what kind of person he'd be when he found out. It turned out that was the only interview that had ever mattered. The following spring, Pierce Grid Systems launched a hiring initiative for professionals whose careers had been interrupted by caregiving responsibilities. The program evaluated candidates on demonstrated competence and excluded any criteria that penalized employment gaps. Terrence ran it. On the first day, he walked into the waiting room to greet the morning's candidates and found Leona sitting among them in a plain jacket, no assistant, a folder in her lap. He stopped. "What are you doing?" he said. "Moral support," she said, "and quality control." He sat down in the chair beside her. Around them, 12 people who had taken time away from careers to raise children, or care for family, or navigate circumstances that didn't fit the standard professional timeline were reading through their materials, straightening their notes, doing what you do when something important is about to happen and you want to be ready. "Any advice?" Leona said. He looked at her. "Don't let anyone make you feel like the gap in your resume is the most important thing in the room." "That's good." "The CEO here is very hard to impress," he said, "but she responds well to honesty." "Noted." She opened her folder. "What else?" "If you see someone struggling in the waiting room," he said, "help them, even if they might be competition, especially then." She looked at him over the top of the folder. "I'll keep that in mind," she said. The door opened. The morning's first candidate was called. Terrence stood, shook the candidate's hand, and led them in. Leona watched him go. then straightened her folder, sat up in the chair, and waited. Not for a position, not for an interview, but for something that had started with a stack of papers on a floor and a man who had chosen at every point where it mattered to tell the truth. Some things were worth waiting for. Terrence never stopped being a single dad. He just stopped being someone the world could afford to overlook. If this story reminded you that competence doesn't come with a dress code, that honesty is the longest game worth playing, and that the people most worth trusting are usually the ones who help you, even when they don't have to, then you already understand what this channel is about. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and if you know someone who's been written off too soon, send this their way. Sometimes the right story finds people at exactly the right time.